Hey everyone, welcome back to Empowered and Out, the podcast where we focus on building careers that actually feel aligned, confident, and sustainable. I'm your host, Jonathan Barbe, career coach and advocate for showing up fully at work. And this season, we're talking about visibility and authenticity, what it really takes to unmask, own your identity, and lead without leaving parts of yourself behind. And this year, we are doing things differently. We're elevating, we're expanding, we're prospering together. Through real conversations and coaching centered insights, my goal is to help you reconnect with your confidence, trust yourself more, and start making career choices that support not just your success, but your well being as well. So take a breath, settle in, and let's get into today's conversation. Today, we're talking with Dr. Ty McKinney from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, about something a lot of LGBTQ plus professionals feel in their bones, but don't always have language for: what it actually costs to our brains, bodies, and careers when we spend years being less than fully ourselves at work. You live at this fascinating intersection of neuroscience, psychology, leadership, and queer entrepreneurship. So we're getting into burnout, expressive suppression, and why authenticity isn't just a nice to have, it's a brain health issue. So Dr. Ty McKinney, welcome to Empowered and Out.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon for this really impactful conversation that we're going to have.
Well, thank you again. I'm very excited. But before we jump in, this is something new for this season. I like to do an energy check-in with all of my guests, and I hope that the listeners and viewers are going to do the same thing. So on a scale from 1 to 10, how is your energy today, and what's contributing to that number?
I would say a 7.5. I've got a lot of exciting opportunities that I'm going to be pursuing. But with that comes a touch of anxiety about, oh crap, I need to make sure I execute those opportunities. And my computer is going through a bunch of burnout today. So that's also contributing, just a touch to that as well.
Nice. I like that. And yes, it is, but that's okay. We moved along and we're doing great. For me personally, I'd say at an 8. Obviously, I'm always at a 10 when I want to start my podcast, but it's been a little bit of a crazy Friday when we're recording this, and a little bit crazier than I was expecting. But with that said, I'm excited to jump in, and so um, let's get going.
All right, let's do it.
All right, so let's start with the big picture. What originally pulled you into studying brain health, burnout, and authenticity in the workplace?
So I guess like if I go back to the very beginning, it was being a disgruntled engineering student. Within my family, I had, seen different challenges associated with burnout and in that regard. And I was not having the best time as an engineering student, having to deal with complex math, advanced statistics, and computer programming. But I became really fascinated by learning about the brain and just how it processes information, and this realization that if you can understand that system and nudge it here and there, that you actually might be able to change the way that people are experiencing some of these challenges for the better. So that was really exciting for me. So I basically dove headfirst into that, and ironically got into a bunch of research labs in this new line where I had to do advanced statistics, computer programming, and complex math. But now there was that alignment, so it was a little less tedious, and it felt like there was better alignment.
Nice. So what were you seeing again and again in queer professionals or founders that made you think that something deeper is happening here?
That's a really good question, because initially, like it just kind of flew under the radar. Again, growing up in a rural community, being gay was not exactly the cool thing back in those days. And so I was bullied for being gay before I even knew what it properly meant. So there was always this implicit urge, desire to, just hide aspects of myself until I knew for sure that it was safe. So as a result, I felt like I had to do this coming out process repeatedly, whenever I would, enter a new space or a new community or what have you. But it wasn't until I was in Salt Lake at the University of Utah for grad school that I started to recognize that I wasn't the only person that was having these challenges, that other queer professionals were also starting to feel weighed down. And that's when my studies helped me appreciate the biology of why I'm feeling that way.
All right, that had to have been a very interesting challenge for you as well. I'm very familiar with Utah, and they're very strong religious, like, um, thinking in the state, I guess you could say. So that had to, especially, coming out, especially in Utah, that could have been definitely a little bit probably more challenging than some people maybe realize, just because of the Mormon faith in Utah specifically.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that the university, the department that I was in, was very secular and very open and accepting in that regard. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that the U had a bit of a rivalry with BYU, which is the Mormon university further south. So it wasn't quite as bad from that angle, but no matter how accepting sometimes the spaces can be, you still bring that extra baggage with you from your past, and that was really what I think was probably the most challenging, was appreciating that I am different. In addition to being queer, I also have ADHD and perhaps a touch of autism, and that just means that I needed to do things slightly differently than a lot of my other colleagues and professionals. But finding a way to do it authentically and also professionally, that took a long time. And I wouldn't say that I even achieved moderate degrees of success for that until after I graduated, came back to Alberta and started my own company, and realized that, well, now I am my own boss. So I guess I have to start doing things, in a more authentic manner. And that's when I would say I properly started to actually get that alignment.
Nice. All right. Well, that definitely had to have helped, having that non-religious push really on you. And yeah, I mean, you were correct. BYU down the road is definitely, yeah, they're definitely a lot more strong on the religious aspect in their beliefs. So we hear about burnout being thrown around constantly, but you frame it in a much more biological way. Can you unpack that for us?
Of course. So really, there's three distinct components to burnout. So the first one is this sense of emotional exhaustion. So I actually made the joke recently, if you wake up and you want to go back to bed instead of going back to work, that's actually your brain's way of saying that you're emotionally exhausted and maybe you should sleep a little bit more. In practice, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's kind of the sense of where that particular component is coming from. I'll get into the biology of that in just a second. The second component is related to your sense of efficacy, your capacity within the workplace. And more or less, once that starts to go down, that's another sign of burnout that's impending. So again, you start to second guess whether or not you're good at your job, start having more anxiety related to that. And then the third component is this sense of you're getting more cynical. It's like the emotional connections that typically would be present in the workplace setting, they seem more dull in that sense. And that, again, is quite challenging, especially if you're in a care provider role, such as healthcare, or you're doing lots of client-facing work, or those sorts of scenarios. So those are the three individual components of burnout, kind of if you think about them at the psychological level. But then if you unpack and go into like the neuroscience, the first one, emotional exhaustion, that's related to our body's stress response system. Basically, we have hormones that allow us to deal with danger. And typically, from an evolutionary perspective, this is related to saber-toothed tigers and chasing down gazelle on the African savanna, because that's, we were uniquely stubborn long distance runners before we were uniquely intelligent. So we've got this stress response system that allows us to really rally our energy and, chase that gazelle, escape from that tiger. But that is only designed to work for, a few hours. If you're really good, maybe several hours kind of thing, not indefinitely. Whereas it's February right now, so tax season is coming up. So if you're a professional that's related to taxes, in any capacity, your fiscal year end is up and coming, you've now got this extra component of stress and burden that's not going to necessarily alleviate until you press that submit button in April. And that's not the kind of stress that our bodies and brains are really designed to handle. So more or less, in those scenarios where we've got this chronic as opposed to acute stress. Again, acute stress is not bad. It's healthy. It's helpful. It's basically what you're doing to yourself when you're working out. But the chronic stress is when you start getting dysregulation in your stress hormones. And that can look in different ways for different people. There's no kind of one size fits all approach. But the general take home is that sometimes there's a threatening situation and your body is just too exhausted to actually rally the resources to deal with that threatening situation. So you just kind of like meh, and you're not performing to your best capacity. Or some people are hyperactive, hypersensitive, where something that may not be super threatening comes around and they have a very exaggerated reaction to it. And either way, what ends up happening is the relationship between, is this a threat that I can deal with? And the way that your body responds to it gets messed up in some capacity. And in terms of the hormones that are present, with cortisol being one of the main hormones that we look at within the scientific labs. So then getting into the next component of burnout, that professional efficacy piece, whether or not you feel confident and capable in your job. For most of us, we have to focus in our job. We have to do task A, then task B, make sure we don't accidentally go on Instagram for a period of time in that. And in order to do that, we need to use particular brain networks. I like to call it the focus network because it's a lot easier than saying frontal parietal singular percular system. I'm actually proud of myself for saying that in one shot. But basically, all those stress hormones interfere with the signaling in that brain network. So as a result, it's actually harder to deploy your focus network in order to, take care of the task at hand. So this makes it a lot harder to resist those distractions. It makes it a lot harder to plan out what your activities and tasks need to be. And it makes it more challenging when you need to switch from one task to another in order to, reorientate yourself. So that's where the professional inefficacy piece comes from, where your brain literally is not functioning at its peak capacity. And then the final component, that cynical piece, well, that focus network is also really important for emotional regulation. So if you experience some anxiety for any number of justified reasons, you'll find it much harder to regulate that emotion and manage it in a healthy, productive manner. Instead, it might come across feeling much more overwhelming. And again, if that happens for a period of time, you start to become a little more blunted to those emotions, and particularly the emotions of other people. So that's where that lack of empathy and that disconnect comes in. Oftentimes, a word that's used in the scientific literature is being more callous, which no one wants to be known as callous typically. So that's kind of the underlying neuroscience of burnout. So again, that sense of emotional exhaustion, how it's related to our stress response system, that sense of professional capacity and efficacy, which again is related to our ability to turn on the right brain networks for the task at hand, and our inability to regulate our emotions, which functionally cuts us off from the social support that is around us.
All right. Wow. Listeners and viewers, you might need to rewind and listen to that all again just so you get the great descriptions, because that's a lot of just great information. It really is. It's mind blown. So to go a little bit deeper on that, so what's actually happening in the brain and the body when someone is burned out?
So again, it's happening at a few different levels. So one of the main things that's going to be happening is the stress hormones are going to be dysregulated in some capacity. And as I mentioned, you can't predict how that's going to look for any individual person, but the TLDR is that they're not doing the job that they're supposed to. You're either too stressed out or not stressed enough, and in either way, you're not responding accordingly. When you are in that chronic stress state, that causes disruptions in other parts of your body as well. So I talked about the cognitive capacity piece, and that's how it affects your brain, but it's also going to affect your GI tract. So again, whether or not you're actually absorbing nutrition and getting all those things that you need, it's going to have influences on your immune system. So again, you're going to potentially be at higher risk of getting sick from an infection, or not healing quite as rapidly. And it can also disrupt your sleep. This is something that I've learned more recently, is the direct relationship between those hormone imbalances and the way that your sleep unfolds in that way. And again, if you don't get good sleep, then that just magnifies all these other problems. And if you have this going for years and years and years, then it'll start to put stress on your heart. So then you're at increased risk for cardiovascular disease potentially. So honestly, the list goes on. It's not good for your body.
Definitely not. So what is the difference between, how does it differ between just being stressed and having just a rough week?
Yeah. So in that regard, I would think about the timeline under which like the stress is experienced. And again, like stress is not a bad thing. Ironically, one of the effective ways to manage burnout is physical activity. You go to the gym, you go outside for a run, and you're literally stressing your body out. But importantly, when you finish up your workout, you have an opportunity to recover, and your stress hormones are rebalancing a little bit, recalibrating. So that's not a bad thing. In fact, that can be quite healthy. Where it gets more problematic is when it goes on and on and on, and there's not the opportunity for the proper rest and relaxation that's needed. Again, if you think back to that evolutionary angle, you chase the gazelle, now you've got some meat and you rest and you eat it, and you've got, hopefully you can wait until at least the next day before you have to go out, hunting again, sort of thing. So from an evolutionary perspective, we're designed to, basically oscillate between we're stressed out and we're relaxing, we're stressed out and we're relaxing. But the way that a lot of professional roles often work is that you don't get that same opportunity for rest and relaxation. A number of professionals feel like they're, on 24/7, responding to emails and text messages. And I mentioned Instagram. You get on Instagram and you doom scroll and all that. And all of that has the effect of basically perpetuating those stress signals so that you're not actually getting the rest and relaxation that your body needs and expects you to get.
Yeah, I've been there. I wouldn't necessarily, for me nowadays, it's the TikTok scroll. That's where I go to, like, if I want to kind of decompress, to kind of just not have to think, just watch funny, dumb things that will make me laugh. And so, all right. Very interesting, very detailed. I like that. So you talk about expressive suppression, which honestly sounds like half the queer community's resume skill set.
Yeah.
So what does that term really mean?
So, expressive suppression is this idea that when your brain has an emotion, it's trying to tell you something. You can think about emotions as turning on survival related circuits within your brain. Again, anxiety is a useful emotion in a number of different ways. So, as a result, I personally find if I experience an emotion, it's really good to one, acknowledge the emotion, think, why am I feeling this emotion? And then usually there's some sort of behavior or action associated with the emotion. Just use the example of anxiety. It's like, oh, I'm worried about this outcome. What can I do to manage that risk so that, I can put it at ease and know that it's not as risky as I was previously thinking? If you don't do that, if you don't, feel that emotion, go through that process, effectively what you're doing is bottling it up in some capacity. You're interrupting that process, that loop, and you're saying, nope, I'm just not going to experience that emotion right now. And that actually is not super healthy. Again, you can't always express an emotion the way you want at any given time. We have professional constraints, but if you don't express that emotion at all, then paradoxically, the emotion will just come back stronger and further dysregulate your stress response system, giving even more signals of stress into your body, and those hormones get even more imbalanced. So again, for queer professionals and really anyone that comes from a more of a traditionally marginalized background, that question of, you want to be your authentic self in the workplace and you're being told you can't for any number of reasons. That's basically very, very similar to having an emotion and not being able to express it. And again, if you're doing that chronically and you don't have the opportunity to, unpack and unwind and all that, and, let those emotions out in some healthy manner, then again, you're just accumulating those stress signals in your brain. And then it leads to burnout more quickly.
So you mentioned that suppressing is obviously not good for ourselves. How does that show up neurologically when we suppress?
So again, you want to think about it over like a time span. So initially, it's not always the worst idea to suppress an emotion as long as it's within a manageable constraint. But the stronger the emotion is, the more there is a bit of a need to express it in some capacity. Um, before coming into this podcast, I had a touch of anxiety, but that's not in a maladaptive capacity. So, just being able to talk about it, make sure I got my water, my coffee in order to manage that anxiety, that helped me alleviate the experience of that emotion. Whereas if I would have come on, you're like, no time, no coffee. That would induce some expressive suppression to the point where I'm like, okay, I guess I'm not going to do that. And Again, it starts getting us thinking about, okay, what are the other things that we're not allowed to do? What are the other ways in which we can't be authentic and present? And again, if you're doing that, then you're not present. And again, that the drive for the stress just keeps increasing.
All right. So, and that makes sense. So, my audience includes many Gen Z young professionals. Why are they especially vulnerable to burnout right now?
I would say that we're all vulnerable to burnout in a number of different ways. It's just a question of how you're managing that burnout. And interestingly, again, if we come back to the workplace, there's a bit of a generational gap for that. Basically, if you're a millennial and 50% of millennials and older, expressive suppression is just kind of socialized into you. If you think about a lot of people that are boomer age, they don't like talking about their emotions and their feelings. They just, want to get the job done. And then the joke is they make, jokes about how horrible their wife is, to compensate. And again, like that is one way to manage burnout. I'm not going to say it's necessarily the most healthy, but it is one way. But again, the other half of millennials and younger generations, including a lot of Gen Z, they basically recognize that that approach of doing expressive suppression just really is not healthy for them. Again, there's generational shifts and change in that regard. So as a result, they're much more likely, if they're in a workplace that is creating expressive suppression, to say, whatever, I'm not going to deal with this and I'm going to go somewhere else. That can be empowering in the sense that you're not feeling the expressive suppression as much. But if you're not building up the resilience that, say, the boomers had in that regard, then it can lead to some challenges in coping with that burnout in different ways. So I would say that everyone struggles with burnout in some capacity. It's really just a question of, is it a silent struggle, or are you being a little bit more vocal about your struggle and trying to go somewhere else in order to manage it? And yet, Gen Z in particular, the data shows that they're much more likely to be vocal about their struggle and just, get out of the situation that's putting them in those scenarios in the first place.
So, you didn't mention the generation, but I kind of feel that Gen Xers are ones who kind of bottle it,
Yeah.
at least
Yes.
in my
Yeah. Kind of
experience.
come in between the millennials and the boomers in that
Yeah, but
sense. Yeah.
yeah, I feel that being a part of that generation, yeah, we do a really good job of bottling. Now, I see it. I see it in my partner. I see it in friends that bottle up, and it's like, why? What are you doing now? Taking a step back and doing what the coaching and talking with many people through this podcast and with my coaching, my eyes have been opened. So I definitely see how everyone reacts differently. So
Yeah. Just one thing, since you pointed out that not every, people react differently. That's actually where kind of the next layer of complexity comes on, is basically neurodiversity. So again, we all have different brains, and some people are just more sensitive to stress and those associated emotions than others. And some people have different coping strategies that may be more or less adaptive. So it's not that bottling up is always the wrong answer. A lot of it comes down to being able to understand yourself. What are your tendencies, and what do you need? Because again, if you perform reasonably well under stress, then bottling it up isn't going to be quite as challenging for you than it might be for other people if they're more sensitive to stress. So again, there's no one size fits all approach. It really comes down to what works best for you and your brain.
all right, I agree. I mean, everyone's different. I agree with you. I feel that you need to kind of look at yourself and how you handle things overall, because I mean, if you have a sibling, your sibling might handle things differently
Oh,
than how
100%.
you do.
Yeah.
I mean, my sister and I, we handle things very differently. And it is funny because both of us did study psychology in college, and we've used it in our roles that we are in today very differently, just based on what we've done in our working environments. So she uses probably a lot of it working with coworkers and those who report to her, where I use it obviously with coaching specifically.
Yeah. No, percent. And again, this concept of emotional intelligence in many ways comes down to do you understand your own emotions? Do you understand the emotions of other people? And how can you regulate yourself and by extension influence others in a way that's overall productive and sustainable? And again, if you don't have that awareness of how you operate, then it's really hard to achieve that.
For sure, yeah. So with these younger generations, especially the Gen Zers, what do companies risk losing if they don't address their vulnerability to burnout
Uh,
early on in their careers?
just to clarify the question, is it what would the Gen Z miss out on, or what would the companies miss
What would
out on?
what would the yeah, what would the companies miss out on?
Basically, talent retention. So again, the days of casual sexual harassment in the office being overlooked by HR, or they're wrapping up. Again, there is much less of a culture of being willing to tolerate that among Gen Z, even though that may have been, somewhat socially normalized in prior generations. So as a result, if people feel uncomfortable as younger generations, they feel uncomfortable in the workplace. If they feel like their burnout risk is increasing, they're much more willing to just be like, okay, bye, I'm going to go find a new job. And then you miss out on that talent. And as the boomers and the Gen X start to retire, then you're not going to have a lot of people around the office willing to tolerate those things. So you're going to have a lot of employee shortages. So quite simply, it's a talent retention problem, and the companies that are going to get a handle on this the best in terms of having better workplace policies that are inclusive, having good benefit packages that actually address the root causes of health and burnout, and providing those resources and support, the ones that understand that you need to hire the right person for the right job and not force people into roles and assume that they're little robots that'll just do what you say, sort of thing. Those are the companies that will be able to retain that talent, and by extension, overall, be able to improve their productivity. So yeah, that's one of the main areas is talent retention. And again, going back to that cognitive efficacy piece, if you're experiencing burnout, you're literally not showing up in the workplace, delivering it your full, and the company's going to pay for that. And it turns out that is very expensive for companies. The last estimate that I heard in Canada is that the average cost of burnout per full-time employee on average is $30,000. So that's not
Ooh.
even, yeah. So basically, that's not even someone that is burnt out. That's just on average the cost of sick days that are due to mental health. The days that you show up when you're not ready for when you're not feeling good for mental health related reasons. And again, you're just not performing at your best. That's referred to as presenteeism. You're showing up, but you're only at 50 to 70% capacity. The stress leave, that's expensive because now the company's paying, at least part of your salary while you're not working. And they have to hire someone else in order to cover for that or rearrange things. And again, that adds additional capacity constraints and reduces productivity and paradoxically induces burnout in other employees. And then eventually your insurance premiums are going to go up. So for your American audience, you have a very different insurance system than Canada. So I'm not sure how that number changes. 30 is a rough ballpark. Yeah, 30,000. And yeah, if you
Wow.
have highly technical employees where they're hard to hire, then that cost goes up.
For sure. And that makes sense. Yeah. So, talking about authenticity not being a free for all
Mm.
and about being regulated and real, how do you define that balance?
No, no, that's really tricky because again, you want to be fully authentic in the workplace, but being fully authentic doesn't mean that you're free to do whatever you want. Again, like, you know, there is this societal contract and social rules and all that are implicit in many ways. So again, like, I mean, it would have been inappropriate for me to be like, hey, Jonathan, I'm having some anxiety, not gonna do this podcast. Bye. Maybe try again next week. Like, that would have been unprofessional on my end and had some negative consequences. So it's not that, there's a free for all just to be fully dysregulated, that there is a balance that needs to be met. And honestly, I think it's a challenge to learn where to find that balance between being authentic, but not throwing the kitchen sink. Yeah, I guess if I think about my own experience in that regard, and like with my being someone that has ADHD, I can be very impulsive, I can be very creative, I have lots of ideas, but that doesn't mean that every idea needs to be executed. And again, like derailing a meeting so then that way I can talk about this idea, like that's not productive. Like that's not helping the company. It's arguably not helping me. So there is a level of still professionalism where you have to find that balance. And it's a question of how can you feel that emotion, experience it in a way that is socially acceptable. Because yeah, trauma dumping all the time is also not, the best way to get things done.
Yeah, for sure. So where do people sometimes get tripped up though, trying to be their whole selves at work?
I guess where I've seen it, um, again, it's this idea that if you have a marginalized identity status, that there can be a little bit of a victim complex that's sometimes there. And in general, I think that's a red flag. I think that while we can be unfairly treated by a system, it is not healthy to identify as being a victim of the system, because being a victim of the system by definition means you don't have choice and agency in the matter, whereas typically we do have some choice and some agency. It's just a question of, can it be effectively deployed, and is it better to switch over to something else in that regard. So no, it that is a really tough balance to find.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. It's being authentic is hard, but to a degree, you have to define. I think what especially is can be challenging for these younger generations is defining that authenticity that you really want to be in the workplace,
Hmm.
because it is a workplace. It's not home. It's not out in a bar. It's not socializing. You are there to do a task at hand. That's why you were hired.
Yeah.
So I feel
And
that
presumably you're being compensated for the task.
exactly. So even being a part of the queer community, that shouldn't, how do I say this without potentially offending some people? You need to be sure that you're doing your job, your task at hand. And it should be, yes, you being a queer individual. Yes, that's who you are. But I don't think that every day you need to walk in with your fingernails painted rainbow colors, your hair different, earrings, whatever it might be. Present yourself in a way that, I guess, to put it bluntly, is not going to get you fired. But also make sure you've done your research to begin with, to start off, to make sure this is a company for you. Even if it's what they might have had the best role on the planet for you to want to do, and that's what your passion is. But if they're very I don't very anti. Now, in Canada might be easier. Here in the United States, it's gonna be a little bit more challenging, and across
We
the world
objectively do have better employee protections for these things. Yeah,
yeah,
our labor laws are much more kind to the individual. Um,
and just the way the state of everything in our country is right now, DEI is gone pretty much, or rewritten in a different way, but you can't what I used to always tell clients is go onto a company's website if you're really interested and see how they share about their diversity, their inclusivity, authenticity, whatever. And if they're unfortunately now we've come to a point, unless that company is private, any of these public companies are they've probably whitewashed it. It's gone. Like
yeah,
there's not, and they're probably not even going to show anything in this upcoming Pride Month when we get to that this year, because especially if they have anything to do with government contracts. Because
yeah,
I've learned that from someone the other day is that, yeah, their company had a bunch of different government contracts and they got rid of anything rainbow related on their website to define the company. And I feel that you just have to be smart, listeners
yeah,
and viewers. Just be smart. Do your due diligence and make sure that you should feel comfortable in the workplace to describe your partner, your friends, that you went to Pride, that you went to some gay bar, whatever it is, because you got to be yourself. Now, you don't have to go into details, but even just that kind of upper level, like kind of overall, you're saying, hey, I did this,
yeah,
or like in my case, I'm in an LGBTQ plus choir, that, and you don't have to give details because at the end of the day, it's not really any of their business. I didn't want to know about other coworkers businesses unless they told me what was going on in their lives, unless we actually formed a friendship. It's none of your boss's business. It's none of your boss's business. It's not even HR's business to know what you do outside of the workplace,
hmm,
because you just need to be yourself and do your job that you were hired for in the workplace. And that's, in my opinion, that's what you,
yeah. I think this would be a really good time to talk about this idea of workplace accommodations, because I think it ties in quite nicely. And again, I'm not super familiar with how this lines up in the U.S. with their employment and labor laws. But in Canada, if you have a disability, which ADHD, autism, a number of chronic health conditions, obviously like mobility related disabilities, There's even some arguments made for like depression, anxiety in that sense, that the employer has a duty to accommodate up until undue harm. So for all the people that are neurodiverse out there, where your brain operates just a little bit differently than the typical person, than a neurotypical person, basically you're min-maxed a little bit. You've got some good strengths, but you've also got some challenges. And finding a way to balance those in a way that lets you be authentic and perform at your best capacity, that's really important. I think that's really at the heart of authenticity in many ways. So I can talk about that most clearly in relation to ADHD from some of my own experiences, but we can kind of extrapolate from there. So again,
Yeah,
like
for sure. Yeah.
I'm very creative. I'm, good at, systems thinking and those sorts of things. So as a result, I can be an effective leader in many ways. However, a lot of my colleagues will not be quick to point out that I'm not always the most organized, and sometimes I'm not always the most attentive to details. And that tends to be really valued in corporate settings. So as a result, I've got some challenges as well. So there is a duty for employers to provide accommodations to help limit the downside with those challenges, so that way you can really lean into your strengths. So I often make the joke, like, my company didn't start taking off until I hired a neurotypical to do operations. And
I
that's,
like that. Yeah.
yeah. And then that's because like those are not the things that I'm particularly good at doing. I'm good at doing other things. So
Okay.
again, being able to have an assistant that is able to help out with some of those kinds of tasks allows me to make sure that I can really be focusing my efforts in the things that I uniquely need to be doing, which in my case is trying to bring in new contracts, grow revenue, showcase the brand, and all those sorts of things. And so again, like that's part of that trade off of being authentic. And again, like if I can really lean into that, then I get to be my authentic self. And the challenges that I have don't have to be damning and hold me back. And there's lots of leaders that I respect in my community, both in the queer community and the heteronormative community, where they've got that emotional intelligence to know where their strengths are, know where their strengths are not, and ask for the help and support to make sure that they're, properly leaning into their strengths. And lo and behold, the ones that do that accomplish amazing things.
I like that. Yeah. A lot of times, those individuals who might have what some consider challenges sometimes are, to put it bluntly, the rock stars in the working world, because they're working even harder
Yeah.
to get to that, the level they want to be at. And then those who don't seem to feel that they might have any challenges, or they just don't, kind of tend to be a little bit lackadaisical. They're not really into it. They're just kind of doing the day in, day out. Where I feel that, yeah, you do. I specifically remember even a company I worked for years ago, that the team that I was on at the time, those of us, interestingly enough, who were all part of the queer community, were the rock stars actually in our department. It wasn't anyone else. We were the ones who were kind of knocking it out of the park. Every single time they brought something up or someone was getting promoted, it wasn't the rest of the team, it was those of us that were a part of the community, which I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah, again, like I mean, I think there's something by virtue of, the normal script of life doesn't exactly work cookie cutter for queer people. We have to kind of chart our own path. So that tends to make us pretty creative. And from a neurodiversity angle, I would call that openness to new experience. We tend to score quite high on that dimension. So again, like that's an amazing attribute that we can bring to the workplace in order to, really, really thrive and succeed. But going back to, as you were saying previously, if you're in an environment where you don't feel comfortable being creative, being open-minded in that regard, then those talents don't get to be used. And by extension, you're
Mm.
going to start incurring the burnout risk, and your company is going to start incurring the productivity reductions.
For sure, yeah. So you work with queer-owned businesses and chambers of commerce. What are the smartest leaders doing differently when it comes to culture and brain health?
That's a really good question. I guess the first one is that like the leaders are, you can tell they've got a deep emotional intelligence. Again, they understand their strengths, they understand their weaknesses, and they're not afraid to be a little vulnerable, because that's just part of the human experience. Again, like I mean, they're not undergoing needless expressive suppression just because they're the boss. I'm like, it's okay to, have a bad day and to be a little stressed out and flustered and, just need to take a minute to recalibrate. That's human in that regard. So I think that's probably the first thing that I see a lot of queer leaders doing that's really effective is, again, they found the way to really lean into their strengths and not let their weaknesses and their challenges become barriers, whether it's through using assistive technology or really thoughtful staffing or what have you in that sense. The other thing that I think is potentially understated is making sure you have access to the right medical resources. Because again, like, I
Mhm.
mean, if you're at the early stages of burnout, that's a warning sign that it's going to get worse. So if you're not, able to take time off and rest and relax in the evening, if you're not able to see a therapist to process those emotions and figure out ways to manage them, again, that's going to start to incur some of that burnout risk. I've been working with a naturopathic doctor in order to try to identify like what aspects of my diet and my hormone signaling is not quite right. Turns out it's quite a bit. But again, like if I didn't have access to benefits, those tools and resources wouldn't be afforded to me. So again, making sure that people have access to the medical resources is really important. And I'll acknowledge that that's a little easier said than done in Canada, or that's a little easier to do in Canada because we've got a publicly funded healthcare system. The benefits are really just covering some of those paramedicals in a number of different ways. But for American companies, it's making sure that the insurance is actually being used effectively so then that way people are getting the resources they need, preferably before they actually need it.
Mhm.
And at worst, when they do need it, they're getting it and they don't have challenges accessing them.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel there are times that, so just go on the US and at that aspect, I definitely know there are times where a lot of times the employers don't really give you all the details of what's really covered in our benefits. And there's times that, yes, you can down the rabbit hole of that insurance company's like website to figure out, okay, what do they really cover, or even, but in this case, you really need to say, hey, are they gonna be able to help me? What do I need? And if you need a therapist, or if you need some different, make sure you're talking to your doctor, or, so your primary care
Yeah,
physician, to make sure that
precisely. Yeah.
because something as simple, I mean, you want to definitely catch the burnout before it gets to be especially health impacting. Um, it's
Well, do you remember how I was
definitely,
talking about those like
yeah.
three different components of burnout?
Hmm.
Basically, in my experience, you first start to feel the emotional exhaustion piece. So you start to feel tired and worn out by the end of the day. So those are kind of like your early warning signs that, the burnout is coming. Like when you're feeling that way because those stress hormones are starting to become dysregulated in some capacity. So that's the first warning sign. Once you get to the point where you're starting to, question your capacities in your job, like, am I really good at doing this? And, all those sorts of things, when the self doubt really starts to creep in, that's when you've had those dysregulated hormones enough that it's starting to interfere with other bodily systems. So again, like, I mean, that's an even louder warning sign that, burnout's probably already there. And the cynicism, basically, most people are not cynical and callous until they're actually fully burnt out, in which case, like, now you need to like unwind in a number of different ways. Just a nice proactive, relaxing bath on a nightly basis isn't going to cut it if you're feeling callous to your clients.
That is true. Yeah. So you're piloting this expressive suppression workshop ahead of Pride Month this year.
Yes.
What can participants expect, and who is it especially designed for?
So right now, we're going to be focusing again on queer professionals. Again, I'm collaborating with one queer chamber of commerce here in Canada, and potentially there might be some other organizations that might partner as well. But the idea is let's start by understanding, like much like we had in this conversation, the fundamentals of burnout from again that science based framework. We can, debate other things, but at least science, we have a bit of certainty and like we understand how these systems work. And again, really understanding what is the cost, both in terms of personal health and productivity, both in and outside of the workplace, as well as for the employer in terms of productivity, where it tends to hit their bottom line, what those costs are for the business. So then that way we can all be aligned in thinking let's proactively manage our burnout so it doesn't get out of hand. And then we have some tools that we can use in order to do burnout risk assessments and try to quantify those impacts for the companies themselves. So more or less for the professionals that will be participating in those workshops, they'll firstly be able to get a quick pulse check of where their burnout is at. And we can have them participate in some this process, this methodology, to be able to be like, okay, this is what your company is paying in terms of a burnout tax. And in general, it's expensive. In general, it's not very sustainable. So that's really the impetus to try to get a handle on it. When you start thinking about it from an intersectional lens, like again, I've been talking about expressive suppression as a queer person, but if you're an African American, if you're an Indigenous person in the workplace where your culture isn't necessarily respected, you're going to have those same expressive suppression experiences that's going to translate over to the burnout risk. If you're queer and Black, then again, you get both of those risk factors simultaneously. So again, when you think about it from an intersectional perspective, while I'm going to be talking about your brain on pride, I'm really this could apply to anyone that is not quote unquote like the default neurotypical. So those are the main benefits that people participating in these workshops would be able to get, and companies participating in these workshops.
That's great. So, what's one breakthrough, though, that you hope attendees walk away with?
If I could, again, take a step back, I think the ability to say no and hold a boundary is one of those things that is really understated. I've done a lot of work in the nonprofit sector where, on average, this tends to be more female dominated and people tend to be more agreeable in general, meaning they're going to prioritize the pleasant social experience of other people, sometimes to their own detriment. So as a result, these individuals really struggle to say no, even if saying no is to protect themselves and not overburden themselves. So I think being able to say no in a professional manner and be able to hold those boundaries is really important. Otherwise, the burnout is going to continue to magnify potentially among the team. Because again, it's just a question of when are the consequences going to catch up to you? Because they will eventually.
Very true. So, how does this workshop help queer owned businesses thrive long term?
So for the specific queer-owned businesses, in terms of the leaders, it's really hopefully helping them appreciate that, again, burnout is not a tax that they want to be incurring, considering it's somewhat optional. And by extension, there's a number of things that you can do to manage that risk. The most clear example in that regard is think about hybrid work policy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we realized, and in fact, many of us can work from home, and going to the office is not necessarily always needed. And again, neurodiversity, some of us are extroverted, some of us are introverted. So again, understanding what are the values and what are the needs of your team and your employees, and being able to develop your policies with enough flexibility that it can accommodate their needs, I think is really important. Again, if you have a team of extroverts, I would recommend actually going to the office is probably beneficial, because they're going to get that social energy. When they get their sale or they do their deliverable, like hey, I did this, and they get that reward, validation, feedback. That's awesome. If instead you have a team of software developers that is relatively introverted, and they can easily do their job from home with a VPN, making them come into the office is arguably not an expense that you need to incur, and is probably going to, frustrate them a little bit and put them not in their best position. And so in that case, having a work from home policy that makes sure things get done, but also takes care of individuals is really important. And again, it's not a one size fits all. So it really comes down to understanding what are the needs of your team and how can your workplace policies empower your team to reach their full capacity.
I couldn't have said that any better. My goodness, yeah. The pandemic was crazy, but crazy time for all of us. But what I realized, well, I worked for a company where I was an essential worker. I actually, we were told we were forced to be in the office every single day. Now, in looking back, they could have given us laptops. We could have been working from home, doing a lot of the work. But it is what it is. But the next company I worked for after I left them, they were all about the hybrid schedule, coming into the office when you needed, we did have certain days a week that we had so many days a week that we had to be in the office. But I will say, even though I kind of joke and say that I'm a lot of times like an introverted extrovert, where
An
when I would go
ambivert.
into the office, I got all the social interaction I needed. I was good. And then when I got home, I was fine. Like I was working at home. When I worked at home, I actually loved working at home more because I actually got a lot more done. But then we'd get to the weekend, and because my partner works from home, he was like, "All right, we got to go out. We go do this." And I'm like, "Do we?" Like, I've really enjoyed not being, I'm enjoying not being around people. Do we, like, you work for a company that you're at home all the time, and I get it. Let's go out, but let's not be crazy about it. Let's, take it easy. It worked most of the time, but yeah, I think now it's very interesting with companies though, and queer owned and not, that the whole working from home, a lot of companies are wanting to pull everyone back into the office. And it's kind of crazy to me because it's not the employee's fault that the company probably got
Has a
into
lease
an
they can't
agreement.
get out of.
Exactly. They had a lease they can't get out of. So they feel that everyone needs to come to the office. Now, the bonus of the last company I was working for, even though we had to have a hybrid schedule partially, even though we were in a bigger office space than we were when I first started with the company, we still didn't have enough desks. So you only really could come in on certain days because we couldn't even handle everyone coming into the office. But I feel that, in my opinion, and it is my opinion, I feel that depending on the role, yes, maybe you should come in maybe a little bit more than others, but I also understand that you should be able to also trust that employee to work from home. And if they have certain standards that they're supposed to be hitting,
And they meet those
on a daily
standards.
basis, when they meet them, then let them stay at home. Don't force them to come to the office. Now, I
No,
loved
yeah,
coming to the office,
100%.
seeing who I need. When I went into the office, I was seeing my boss. I was seeing my boss's boss. I was seeing other teammates, in our department. And then if I had other projects going on, especially during Pride Month, ironically, we would get together. It was much better getting into a room with people than being on a Zoom call because, yes, I do a lot of Zooms, especially with this podcast and with clients, but sometimes it is nice to be in person with those people that you're
Mhm.
working. Sorry, any possible future clients, I'm not meeting with you in person. It's just not happening. It's going to be online.
Just gotta have an
But
annual summit where everyone gets together to meet each other.
yes, exactly. But yeah, so I kind of feel that it's interesting to see how certain places still, be it up in Canada or in Europe or wherever across the world, that are very still sticking with the work at home, the work from home, and where for some, like you said earlier, like because of leases or whatever it might be, companies here are pulling people back into the office. And I can tell you, it is weird to go. So my days in the office were like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday when I was in the office. So Mondays and Fridays I was at home. What's funny is I feel like a lot of people who did the work who were working from home, those Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays downtown here in the Denver area seem to be when everyone is in the office. And Mondays and Fridays nobody is around. And it's really kind of funny because, I mean, I get it. Don't get me wrong. It's nice to kind of, in a way, roll out of bed on a Monday morning and not have to worry about getting all ready to drive and go to the office. But by the way, I never just rolled out of bed. I was always showering. I had to do my routine. Even during the pandemic, well, mainly during the pandemic, I still had to go into the office. So I did my typical normal routine. And I know a lot of people went to the extreme of not doing that routine, which, by the way, that's not good for your mental health when you had to go back into the office. You needed to be sticking with that routine. And I mean, I'm sure you would agree, like your brain is used to a certain routine. And when also you go completely opposite of it, not showering, not,
Yeah.
eating times. I mean, for my sister, there are many times where she only put on makeup when she had a meeting virtually. So she's like, all right, that's when I'm putting on makeup. Oh, my hair's on ponytail. I don't even remember the last time I washed my hair. I'm like, okay, well, first off, gross. But it's interesting. I'm happy that we lived through that crazy time, but going back to, unfortunately, these younger generations, especially Gen Z, they were very much affected by this timing of everything. And even the younger, with how schooling was done, how education was done, I hope that they can learn, especially with these younger generations, like especially Gen Z, that it helps them a little bit.
Yeah.
Get a
No,
focus in place because
I
uh,
would say if I can get one more kind of like a biohack related to this that I think could be really helpful, oxytocin. So oxytocin is actually a stress hormone that is released when we're under conditions of stress, but we also feel that sense of social support. And what's interesting about oxytocin is it inhibits the release of cortisol in our at the level of our brain. So, when you go into the office or you meet up with people in person, you have an increased capacity to get that social support, make those bonds with other people, form friendships and all that. And that is actually very protective against burnout. Again, if you're stressed and you're going it alone, that sucks. But if you're stressed and you got a team and you feel supported and it's just a question of being able to rally the resources, that is much more manageable. I think especially for like the Gen Z, the question is how can they still get access to those that sense of social support despite the way that things might be moving in different directions. Because again, fundamentally humans are social creatures. It doesn't matter
mhm,
how introverted you are, you do need other people in your life typically.
yeah,
And it's just a question of how can you make those interactions as not needlessly stressful as they can be. And there's different strategies to being able to deploy that. But yeah, going back to this idea of expressive suppression and queer professionals and how it relates to burnout risk. Again, if you're not allowed to be your authentic self in the workplace and have people see that and be attracted in some social capacity to the fact that you are who you are, and make informed decisions about who they're associating with, then you're not giving people that opportunity to form those social connections in that way. And again, the companies are going to end up paying that in a burnout tax, and the individuals are going to end up paying for that in their personal health.
yeah, for sure. All right, so you have answered some amazing questions in some great detail, and I hope the listeners and the viewers have enjoyed that. But now is my favorite time of my podcast because I get to have my what I call my rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Every guest that I have come on, nobody gets to prepare for these. These are just random. Now, I will admit, I do cheat a little bit. I take what I'm going to ask and then I shoot it out to ChatGPT and I say which I use, and I say, okay, let's make some fun.
Hmm.
Let's have some fun. Let's ask some quirky, funny, maybe ridiculous questions and have some fun. So, only rule is, Ty, you can't think a lot about these answers. They're rapid fire for a reason. I want you to give me whatever answer comes to you first.
I'm going to do my best not to accidentally be offensive with the first way that things are worded.
All right. All right. So, ideal workday soundtrack: lo-fi beats, pop divas, classical focus music, or chaotic silence.
That's a go. So like, I mean, lo-fi helps me get into like the zone a little bit more, so I enjoy those kinds of beats. But sometimes I need a little bit more stimulation, so that's when something that's a little bit more kind of alternative rock really hits the spot. Yeah, usually around the afternoon, that's when I'm like, yeah, I want to listen to some Offspray.
Nice. Yeah, my partner works in silence. I don't know how he does it. That drives me insane. I have to have something playing. For me, I kind of like, I'm like a little bit similar to you. Like, I like those lo fi beats to start off kind of my morning and then getting into some a little bit maybe more upbeat. And then getting ready for a podcast, I have some very strong motivational music that I'm always listening to kind of get me pumped up. And then, yeah, I can't do silence, but that's
Um,
just me. And then
late
honestly, I'm weird. Also will listen to, because I'm now in choir season, I'm listening to choir rehearsal tracks or the actual that music that we're rehearsing right now. But that's because I'm
yeah.
in a choir.
No, I've actually done a whole other workshop and talk around kind of like the neuroscience of music and how it can be helpful for burnout and addiction recovery management. So I could nerd out on that in a little bit more detail, but I'll leave it with I have recently discovered French Afro beats. And I really like those. It's much more moody. There's some energy in there, and there's just something about people that come from Africa speaking French that just resonates in a way that English doesn't quite.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah.
I might have to check that out. All
Uh,
right. So, yeah. So, one tiny habit that instantly makes your day better.
getting enough coffee. Yeah, it's not some I know I probably drink too much coffee, but there's just something about like, oh, like that was a satisfying cup of coffee, whether it's an Americano or some drip coffee or every now and then a latte. Yeah, it just hits the spot and I'm like, all right, let's get something done. Until around like 4 o'clock rolls around and someone's like, all right, let's switch to a beer, preferably an IPA.
Nice. All right. So, because we've been talking about it a lot today, if Burnout were a cartoon villain, what would its name be?
I got hormonal castration.
Nice.
I get the reason why I say that is again, if you have dysregulated stress hormones, it actually will take the hormone that converts testosterone over to estrogen, that aromatase enzyme, and upregulate it. So then, paradoxically, you end up with an imbalance in your sex hormones, which is also not good.
All right. And last question. And this kind of relates, well, it relates in multiple ways, but especially because of kind of prefacing your workshop coming up in Pride Month. Pride Month vibe, parade dancing, panel moderating, rooftop cocktail, or cozy recovery brunch.
All of the above. Why do you have to choose between those?
I love that.
No,
I'm right there with you, Ty. Like, yeah, all of the above. I don't know how I could say how we could choose. Like, that's no.
yeah, no. Yeah, you need a little bit of each of those things, I think, to fill different parts of your soul. And I'm very privileged that I live in Calgary. So after Pride Month comes the Calgary Stampede, where the city of 1.5 million people gets another 500,000 visitors, and we all cosplay as cowboys for 2 weeks. So I get even more of everything that you just said, just, with a slight Western twang.
Awesome. I like that. All right. So, for people just starting out who are realizing how exhausting it is to constantly edit themselves at work, what's one small, doable change that they could make this week to support their brain and show up fully?
I would say make sure that you're taking space to rest and be your authentic self in a safe space. Again, maybe the workplace is not the safe space where you can be your fully authentic self for any number of reasons, and that's unfortunate. But if that's not an option that's available to you, make sure that you do have an outlet to be your authentic self and feel empowered and safe and secure in that way. So again, that could be, going out dancing with your rainbow colored hair and your nails done and all that. It could be a nice brunch on Saturday morning. As long as you got some space to be your authentic self, like then you can and feel that sense of safety, then you can get energized by those environments and not have to incur burnout risk in your downtime.
I like that. All right. So, thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in. And Ty, this has been such a grounding and energizing conversation. Thank you for reminding us that taking care of our brains isn't indulgent, it's strategic, it's
Mhm.
human. Honestly, it's how we build careers that actually last. So, we'll make sure listeners and viewers to link your upcoming workshop for queer owned businesses and all the ways folks can connect with you in the show notes. And to everyone listening and viewing, if this episode hit close to home, that's not an accident because you deserve a career that doesn't require you to disappear to succeed. So, Dr. Tai, thank you so much for being here.
My absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for having me. It was a lovely conversation. And I'm excited to see where things go.
Awesome. So, listeners and viewers, until next time, stay empowered, stay out, because your career should never require you to disappear.